This is Wheelbearings. I'm Dan Roth from Forbes.
And I'm Sam Abul-Samad from Navigant Research. And Rebecca is off somewhere in California today, driving the new Subaru Outback. The Outback, yes, that's it.
Yeah.
So she'll be back with us next time.
And anytime there's a new Subaru, it's kind of it's an event. The Outback doesn't seem to get refreshed all that much, so that's kind of a thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, Subaru doesn't have a huge lineup. They don't have that many models, and they get replaced on a fairly regular cadence, like every 5 or 6 years. But still, when you don't have that many models, it's not like they have a launch every other week like some companies do.
That's true. I would like them to bring a new SVX. I think that would be fantastic.
I always liked the design of the SVX. It was a really cool looking car.
It was weird, and that's why it's perfect.
Well, yeah, but it was different. I don't know that I'd call it weird. It was not classically Subaru weird. It was a more avant-garde design, or more modern design. That was certainly out of character for Subaru, and it wasn't quite like anything else on the road.
Yeah, I think it was a Giugiaro design. I think.
Yeah, it was.
And it wore its shortcomings as its trademarks, like the little fighter jet window within a window.
Yeah,
that everybody remembers, and the reason why it had those windows was because the door couldn't hold the large piece of glass. I mean, it was clever.
Details.
It was a good solution. It had the 6, and I think it cost like $30,000 back in the 90s. So,
yeah, it was fairly expensive, and it didn't sell very many of them. But it was a neat looking car.
Yeah, they should do that again. Although they do have not to get off on a super change, but they do have the coupe, so they're all set. So
yeah, kind of.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on. We're going to talk about the cars that we're driving and the Corvette and some other things, where our conversation leads. So let's jump into what we've been driving. So Sam, what have you been driving?
Well, I was in I was finally in a Shelby GT350 Mustang for a week, and it was a glorious week. It was fantastic.
Yeah, that sounds like a good time.
After 3 years after it launched, I finally got to spend some extended time with a GT350, and it was all I expected.
Wait, was this the first time you've driven one? Like for that period?
No, actually, I drove one, about a month and a half ago at M1 Concourse for a track day. That was the first time I had driven the GT350. But this is the first time I've, spent extended time with it and, lived with it for a week. And I love that engine.
Oh yeah.
And I'm gonna miss engines like the Voodoo V8 when they eventually go away.
Yeah, and it's funny because I actually last week, at the end of last week, I spent some seat time in a Mustang, the 10 millionth Mustang. It had stickers on the doors and a plaque on the dash that said so, which was interesting. But it was just a regular sort of a GT convertible, and I didn't expect to really be all that impressed. But for the money, that is, even just the GT is a hell of a car, and the Coyote V8 is fantastic, but the Voodoo is, that is an engine.
Yeah, I mean, anything that'll rev past 8,000 RPM, without complaining at all, and making the sound that thing makes, is something you gotta love it, and it's one of those things that we probably won't, at least not from from companies like Ford. We probably won't see many engines like that again in the future. We've got the GT500 coming in a few months, which is sort of somewhat related to this, but it doesn't have the flat plane crank. It's got a beefed up version of the 5.2 liter block. And it's got a big honking supercharger bolted to the top. It puts out, another 240 horsepower more than this thing does. But, there's something about a naturally aspirated V8 that revs past 8,000 RPM and just makes glorious sounds out the exhaust pipe that, for somebody who's an automotive enthusiast, you got to love it, and my wife and I took it to go to the lake on Saturday. And, when I got, past, I got to a spot where, it wasn't going to disturb too many of the locals when I
Come on, you want to see the birds fly out of the trees.
I was going past a nature preserve, so I stepped on it and went accelerated to a fairly healthy speed,
a brisk pace,
and then backed off, because I know that there was a risk that there might be police officers in the not too distant future. And, then after I did that and I saw that there was nobody around, she said, do that again. So even though she wasn't fond of, trying to get in and out of the big Recaro seats, she did like the sound of that car.
Yeah, that's a hard car to dislike. And I think the thing that you said, too, that's important to remember about the GT350 is that you lived with it for a week. Because it's, for what it does, it's really quite a capable sports car. But you can live with it. Even with it being sort of so edgy, you could daily drive that thing. I commuted in it. It was, it's not the most comfortable, cushy car, but it certainly didn't have any problem.
But it also doesn't punish you either. I mean, it's got the Magna Ride dampers on there are standard now. They used to be an option on the base GT350. They're now standard on all GT350s. And those things do a remarkable job of providing a reasonable amount of compliance while still being able to tighten up almost instantaneously and keep the body from moving around, which is a great thing. And then the other thing about the Mustang in general, compared to especially compared to a Camaro, is you can actually see out of it. It has a decent sized trunk. You can see out of it in all directions. So it's not an unreasonable car to live with on a daily basis. Now, the downside, one of the downsides is that it does also come with Michelin Pilot Sport Cup 2 tires on it, which you probably don't want to take this thing out in the rain, especially if it's accumulated any significant number of miles behind at the hands of various members of the automotive media. If the tires are fresh, you might be able to get by in a rainstorm, but in general, you probably want to avoid rain with those tires. But on dry pavement, they are fantastic. They're, what I saw at the M1 Concourse is they're very forgiving tires. When you do approach their limits, you can get to their limits and, you can get it to slide past the peak of traction, and, they don't just snap away on you. They give up traction in a nice progressive manner, so that you don't have to be, a professional race driver to use a car with tires like that on it. They're relatively easy to drive on.
Are those the ones that are actually the Mercedes compound? Or maybe I'm thinking that's going to be the 500. I can't remember off the top of my head, but
I know for the GT350, Ford Performance actually worked with Michelin to develop a custom compound specifically for the Mustangs. And I think the GT500 is also getting a special Ford compound. But I'll have to double check on that. But the GT350 definitely has specially formulated tires specific.
They work. I can't remember. I had it last year. Maybe it was even earlier. Maybe it was the summer before. I can't even remember. It just left quite an impression when I had that car for a week, and I can't remember whether I drove it in the rain. I can see how it might get a little squirrely. Any of those cars, if you treat them with respect, though, the Hellcat was the same way. If you're not stupid with it, you're not going to get in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, don't be like one of those idiots, that you see the videos of driving away from a Cars and Coffee event, and hammering the gas pedal and spinning it around and immediately crashing into stuff. Don't be that person. But treat it treat it with the respect that any car that makes 500 horsepower or more, deserves. And, you'll be fine. You can enjoy driving it. It's, it's certainly, in 2019, any car with that level of performance is more than you can reasonably use on public roads, at any kind of sane speed.
But you can try.
But you can certainly try. But, at the very least, if you want to take it to a track day, you can have a ball with this thing, in a reasonable manner. You're as long as you, like I said, treat it with respect, you're probably not going to crash the thing, and you can turn some great lap times with it and have a great time, work on your driving skills, and, then drive it home and, just behave.
Well, the thing is too, like you said, if you treat it with respect, they're not hairy like you'd expect. They're not like the old school cars where they're really cammy. So there's nothing until you get up on the cam, and then they're kind of hard to control. It's all very, very docile, even though it packs more performance than just about anything that came before. And it's a deal. It's like $60,000 to start, and it comes with I think they're calling it the GT350 Track Attack, which is a driving experience, a one-day event. So you can buy it and then learn how to ring it out, which I would highly recommend when you get a car like that. A, you get to see what it can do in a controlled environment, and B, it gives you a little bit more of an understanding of what it can do, what it can't do, and what you should and shouldn't do with it. So it just, that's the thing that the Mustang has always done, is just really delivered a lot of performance for the money. And $60,000 may seem expensive, but I really don't think so. When you take it all as a piece, it's a good handling car. It rides well. It's not just all engine. It's probably the best of its class.
Yeah, very easily. It in a straight up drag strip run, it's not going to beat a Hellcat Challenger, but it's definitely going to outhandle it. And under some conditions, certain Camaro configurations are probably going to lap faster. Like a ZL1 Camaro, it's probably going to be a little quicker around a track. But in terms of that balance of something that you can drive every day and have, hellacious performance, and, that looks really cool, it's definitely hard to beat a GT350.
Yeah, and so, we're kind of embarrassed for choice, right? You've got the Camaros, the ZL1, like you said, the 1LE, this thing, the GT350. So you can pick your brand like you used to. And of course, the Hellcats, of course, which the Hellcats, they're a little bit of a different thing, and they are slightly hairy. you gotta watch it with that.
Well, and no doubt the GT500 is going to have probably a similar degree of hairiness to when it arrives, to a Hellcat, because it's going to have 760 horsepower, and God knows how much torque.
That's so absurd.
I know, it's nuts. I mean, nobody needs that kind of power on the street. Anything over 200 horsepower is probably severe overkill.
I'll take it.
But
yeah,
it
sure does
sometimes.
So what was your routine when you got in it? I had a certain routine when I'd get in the GT350. Especially, I parked it in the parking garage the whole week I had it, just so I could hear it start. But then I would also, make sure I had all the settings correct every time.
So I would motor out of my neighborhood at sedate speed because I like my neighbors. I don't want to piss everybody off. So a couple of blocks. Once I got to the perimeter of the neighborhood, then switch it over to sport mode and put the exhaust in sport mode, and open it up a little. Yeah,
the sport mode exhaust was key. I think that's probably the first thing I did. Would be to set it into sport mode. Just because you can hear the dampers open back up. Because, they always, all the cars with the dampers, they'll give you a little bit of roar, and then they close the dampers down real quick. But when you put it in sport mode, it just opens. And that engine just wails and snorts and pops. I remember just kind of driving it in second gear a lot.
Yeah, you never want to short shift a GT.
No. Well, and it's not. It's got what's its horsepower is like 5 something, but its torque is
it's 520,
which is that's healthy. The torque is 429. It's like 100 foot-pounds less torque than horsepower, which I mean, it's not a huge deal. It's still a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's got a little less torque than a standard GT, but it also revs 2,000 RPM higher.
Right, and that's there is a difference, horsepower versus torque, and so it doesn't. I don't really care. The numbers don't really matter at that point. The car's just
I mean, it's more than enough torque that it doesn't. It's irrelevant.
Yeah. All right. It sounds like you enjoyed it.
What about you? I did. I had a blast.
Speaking of irrelevant, let's talk about what I was driving. So I had 2 hybrid crossovers back to back, and it was really interesting to just take the sampling. It's sort of like the top and the bottom of the class. So the first week I had the 2019 Mitsubishi Outlander GT plug-in hybrid, which we've acknowledged before is really old stuff. It is interesting what they've done to give this platform a plug-in hybrid. They've cleverly packaged it. It's as good as it can be. And I don't have terrible things to say about it. I think it's kind of a cheap shot to talk about how old Mitsubishi stuff is, because that's obvious. And then right after that, I drove the 2019 Toyota Rav4 XSE,
which is not old.
Brand new. So I had the XSE hybrid. There's a couple of different hybrid trim levels. So the XSE, I think, is supposed to be the sporty one. It's got the blue dampers and stuff like that. The difference is quite stark. The Outlander really does feel like a car that was designed 20 years ago and given a battery electric powertrain or like battery, the plug-in hybrid powertrain. And I don't think it would have been that stark if I didn't drive the RAV4 right after. Because the Outlanders, it's actually, I think it's probably a better EV than it is just a regular crossover. It'll do, I want to say it's like 14 miles of electric only range. It has, features where you can charge the battery while you drive. And you can select when to use EV mode and when not to use it. Of course, you can plug it in. It gets only okay fuel economy on sort of operating as a standard hybrid. But it does, pretty well as an EV in stop and go. It was really well suited for that. But the body shell is not the most modern. So it rides and handles only so well. It actually feels like it's probably 500 or 700 pounds too heavy, because it's 500 or 700 pounds too heavy. There's just no way of getting around it. But you go down the list.
It is what it is.
You go down the list,
which isn't much.
It's a
or in some cases too much.
Crossover. It has, on paper, it measures up pretty well in terms of features. Its tech is old. They're kind of limited, I think, with the vehicle architecture. So in terms of like the nav and all of the infotainment stuff, it's driven by basically a doubled-in size head unit. And I don't see that changing until they really shift the architecture. And I think the Eclipse Cross, which I haven't driven yet, but I think that has a newer infotainment setup with a larger screen and stuff. And we'll start to see that stuff propagate across the line as they replace their old stuff. And they're doing that as they continue to reap the benefits of their sort of on again, off again partnership, which I don't know where that stands. The Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi.
Well, Nissan took a significant equity stake in Mitsubishi a couple of years ago. And so, Mitsubishi is part of the alliance. And regardless of what ultimately happens between Renault and Nissan, at least for the foreseeable future, Nissan, retains a controlling stake in Mitsubishi. And I believe that they're working on new vehicles for Mitsubishi now based on, Renault Nissan platforms. So I would guess that the next generation Outlander we'll probably see that within the next 18 months.
Okay.
And it'll probably share its platform with the next generation Rogue, which is a similarly sized vehicle. And it is also due for a redesign, which I would guess probably sometime in 2020. We'll see both a new Rogue and a new Outlander.
That's not a bad thing. I actually would take the Rogue now compared to the Outlander. I think the Rogue is actually a pretty good vehicle. I think Mitsubishi's experience with actually bringing in electrification to market is going to help. I know that Renault and Nissan were working pretty deeply on that as well. So we should see them continue.
Yeah, well, Renault and Nissan have focused more on battery electrics than on hybridization. So, if this partnership, yields, say a new Rogue and a new Outlander that, offer, at least a plug-in hybrid powertrain, and then maybe even a battery electric version, at some point down the road, that would make for an interesting combination.
Yeah. But the thing that they're going to have to compete with is the new RAV4, which is,
and the new Escape, and
that's true. The new Escape is going to also be a
whole bunch of other stuff.
The RAV4 was very impressive. It's just, before I leave the Outlander 2, it's also $42,000 sticker price, which seems like a lot, even with tax incentives and stuff. And it seems even more like a lot when you look at the RAV4, that it's the new TNGA architecture from Toyota. It drives really well. It's got better space utilization. It's just, you get in the RAV4 and you go, oh, this is how you make cars. And it's 36, almost 37. So it's more car for the money, and it's really just that much better made. So I can't ever, I think, get over how good the TNGA platform is from Toyota. Everything I've driven on that is just really exceptionally pleasant, not just like acceptable. It's rigid. They've tuned it well. It's got the right kind of steering torque just to feel good. It doesn't have a ton of, it's not a sports car platform. It doesn't really have a ton of like steering feel or anything, but it just, the way everything sort of operates together. Whereas the older platform of the Mitsubishi will it'll roll and then it'll take a set, and then it does these discrete movements where the RAV4 is a lot more fluid, and it's just from behind the wheel. It's very much more refined. New Toyota infotainment is better. It's still also not great, but it's several generations ahead of where Mitsubishi is. It's just an interesting contrast, but the
Mitsubishi still has an old, has I think a Rockford Fosgate head unit in there. And does the Outlander now have a head unit that supports Android Auto and CarPlay?
I think it does.
So that puts it ahead of Toyota.
Yeah.
Because Toyota doesn't do Android Auto yet.
It's coming, though. They're going to release some software and take care of that.
Eventually. It's in the Avalon, I think, so far. That's the only one they've released so far for whatever reason.
They'll get. If anybody will get there, they'll get there. But the thing that strikes me the most when I look at the RAV4, and I liked how it had silver like lower body and then a black roof. So it's just Toyota's incorporating two-tone throughout their lineup in certain places. The CHR has it, and now they're doing a little bit more of it.
Yeah, a lot of OEMs are doing that now across a lot of especially crossover models, to try to break it up a little bit, so they don't look quite so monolithic.
Yeah, I like that. It's clever.
It's a good trend.
They can keep that up. That has my approval. Not that it matters.
Hey, it's better than something that's either white, silver, or black.
Yeah, that's true. But the RAV4 just on its own, everything they did about this is old school Toyota overachievement. It's just the ergonomics are great. It's comfortable. It's not super quiet. It's a little bit loud because I think probably because it has low rolling resistance tires on it. But it's just nicely finished. The materials are good, which has been a common complaint of mine about Toyotas, especially the RAV4. The interior just didn't feel all that nice. They've managed to, at least in the XSE trim, make it a pretty nice place to be. I'm sure the Limiteds are even a little bit nicer. So it's just, it's like they did their homework. They heard all the criticism, and they delivered. This is a fantastic vehicle, and I can understand why it leads to the field. And it's got to be the best selling Toyota there is right now in the U.S. market.
I think it's ahead of the Camry.
Maybe not
now.
the hybrid, but just the RAV4 as a whole. My assumption would be that this is probably the best selling model they make, and I can see why. And it's a very good car. I have no complaints. And then I'm finishing up. I just want to say, I've got the 500C Abarth from Fiat. It is definitely a car that has lived past its time.
Manual or automatic?
I didn't realize they made it in an automatic. They make that's
they
a tragedy.
do. When I had one a couple of years ago, it was an automatic, which made a lot of noise. Not so much thrust.
It's not really all that powerful, but I think that's one of the things that's fun about it.
160 horsepower.
You can whip up the anger, and it makes all these noises, and it'll wind it up in first gear and throw in the clutch. It'll pop from the exhaust, which is always hilarious. It's just fun. You look around the interior and it's super outdated. The materials are not good. The design, the ergonomics are wacky because it's Italian. It's one of the few cars I got that has a key. It's electronic. You want to talk about electronics that are way behind the curve? It's got TomTom nav and it's teeny little 4-inch screen. I think my antique phone is bigger. But it's just so much fun though. It's got a lot of character, and it's really. It's one of those cars that's just entertaining to drive. It handles pretty well. This is the 500C, so with that large section of roof missing, you can feel a little bit of cowl shake, but it's fun. So it's one of those few cars that it's not that expensive. It offers a lot of fun for the dollar, and
it's got a lot of character.
It really does. And I would heartily recommend it. You just have to go into it knowing its shortcomings, which you can totally ignore, because it makes up for them by being really super entertaining.
On the other hand, if you live in California, and you want a super entertaining Fiat 500, there's also the 500e, which I actually personally find to be more fun to drive than the Abarth. It's not as loud, but it's got, because it's an electric, it has all that low end torque. And it's actually a real hoot to drive.
I bet. Yeah, that's probably the best one. It's funny how the EVs, that was what I was thinking about the Outlander too. Is this is a pure EV. It's so much better. It's quieter. It's smoother. It's torquey. All of those things. It's like if you have a bad old platform, just electrify it. You'll get another couple of years out of it.
Yeah, easily. Yeah.
All right. So let's.
Well, before we leave the garage, I pulled up the Toyota sales numbers through the first half of the year, and the RAV4 was, in fact, Toyota's best-selling nameplate. They sold 200,610 of them in the United States by the end of June, versus 176,000 Camrys and 153,000
Corolla. 176,000 Camrys, so they're still doing 350,000 of those a year. That's not bad.
Yeah. And 400,000 RAV4, so that's some serious volume. Yeah. You're getting into full size pickup truck volumes there.
And they're all. That's the funny thing too. They're all the same basic car. I mean,
that is pretty remarkable. That they're like Volkswagen. They have been able to take a basic platform and stretch it over a remarkable array of vehicles, from the Prius, which was the original one that they launched with, to the new Corolla, the Camry, the Avalon, the Rav, and a variant, an updated variant of TNGA is even used for the new Highlander that's coming this fall.
Yeah, and they could have just made an adequate platform. They made a good one.
Well, I think we can thank Akio Toyota for kind of changing the attitude at the company. For really inspiring them to create vehicles that are really enjoyable to drive. That they still have all the attributes that made Toyota great. They're reliable. They're very functional, but now they're also not boring.
Yeah, and that was a shock to actually, especially in like a Rav4 Hybrid. I think that's a double whammy of like, okay, it's the crossover, the high volume crossover, and a hybrid. Like, I can't roll my eyes hard enough, but
it's going to be very interesting this fall. To put the Rav4 Hybrid up against the new Ford Escape Hybrid, and eventually the Honda CR-V Hybrid, to see how they compare against each other.
The Toyota Hybrid's gonna, it's got to be the benchmark. It's really smooth. You really can't feel a handoff between EV and gas engine, and you certainly can't feel the handoff between regen and friction braking. They've had a lot of practice at this, so Ford and Honda better bring their game. That's all.
Apparently, some kind of car was unveiled in California.
Okay, so that's the weirdest part. Tustin. Where the hell is Tustin, and why would you unveil it there?
Somewhere in Orange County, because there was a big blimp hangar there.
Okay,
which is again, why there? I don't know.
Okay, and did we ever? I don't think we ever figured out the significance of 718.
Because it coincided with the Apollo 11 mission. It wasn't It wasn't the launch day, which was July 16th. It wasn't the day they landed on the moon, which was July 20th. It was when they were halfway to the moon.
So this is just their moonshot. Is that what they're trying to?
Apparently, I guess, yeah. And Chevrolet started the program with bringing out two astronauts, bringing out one of the Kelly brothers. Was it Scott or Mark? I can never remember which one's which. The one who isn't running for Senate, who spent the one who spent a year on the space station. I want to say
that's Scott Kelly.
And I think you're right. And I'm blanking on the name of the woman, but they came out and did about a 10 or 15 minute spiel on the space program and how which eventually kind of wound around to how Corvettes have been such an important part of the astronaut story over the years. So many of the astronauts in the 1960s were Corvette drivers. Eventually they actually got around to the car itself.
Well, they gave them Corvettes.
They gave the
Apollo
Alan Shepard
Corvettes. So I don't know if it was.
No, they gave the Mercury astronauts Corvettes.
Mercury. All right.
Or at least they gave Alan Shepard one. I don't know if they gave Corvettes to all the other Mercury astronauts or they had to buy their own. But Alan Shepard, who was the first American to go up, got one from a local dealer in Florida.
Okay. That's all rather well documented, I'm sure. But either way, I think we should probably make sure that everybody knows what we're talking about, that they introduced the C8 Corvette, the 8th generation of the Corvette, which is something that happens. You get a new Corvette once every 20 years, it seems. I guess it's been a little sooner than that. But the C7 debuted.
Yeah, the C7 came out in 2013. Okay.
Wow, that's a pretty good. That's not bad. That's a tight lifespan for a Corvette.
Yeah, and granted, the C7, was mechanically at least was largely an evolution of the C6. Yeah. It had a new design, but it wasn't radically different mechanically from the C6.
Well, they do that too. So it's almost like every couple of generations you get a big shift, right? So like you had the C2 that was a big shift from the very rustic original, which was basically an early 50s Chevy chassis, frame that was sort of hot rodded up a little bit, and a fiberglass body. Then they went to the C2 it had, independent rear suspension, and it was the sort of the first, it was the split window. And then the C2 was totally rebodied, and they tweaked it a bit, but the C3 was pretty much C2 architecture, just updated. And that lasted till, okay, so the C2 came out in 63, and it lasted to 82. That's 20 years of C2, C3 architecture. And then the C4 was a huge, I think the C4 was probably in I guess there were no 83s, so it was the 84 Corvette.
Yeah, there were some 83 Corvettes built, but they were never sold to the public. They were pre-production cars, saleable pre-production cars that never actually got sold to the public.
I think we failed to appreciate how big a shift that car was in 1984. That it really legitimized the Corvette. It went from an antique that looked really good, that by that time had become kind of ridiculous, to this really, wedgy, modern, high-tech, advanced sports car that didn't cost as much as the other cars that it would outperform. And we still have that today. That's still what the Corvette does.
Yeah, I mean, the C4, was in many respects, compared to, the top competition of the day, was still kind of crude. It was far more sophisticated than the C3. But it still didn't have a lot of structural integrity. If you ever drove a C4 Corvette down the road, it had that big clamshell hood, and you could see that thing shaking and vibrating as as it hit bumps in the road. It had a very stiff suspension system. On a nice smooth skid pad, it could generate some really impressive lateral acceleration numbers. But as soon as you hit some bumps in the road, things got squirrely really fast.
That's the entertainment.
and before I forget, the other astronaut who was at the reveal was Mae Jemison, who went up on the Space Shuttle Endeavour, and it was Scott Kelly who was there with her on stage.
All right. Astronauts are always fun people to talk to. And I think there's probably a higher proportion of astronauts that like really fast cars than other professions.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about, when you're used to traveling at 17,000 miles an hour, when you're back on Earth, you want something reasonably quick.
This is almost as good as an Apollo rocket.
You get spoiled a little.
So the C8 is, like you were saying, it's
a little different.
C6 was evolved into C7, and so the C8 is it actually is that mid-engine Corvette. This is the mythic car that we've been hearing about since 1960 something.
It's the unicorn of sports cars.
It's here. Like I was asking on Twitter, like, is Don Sherman alive? Did he just float up to heaven?
He apparently is alive, and from what I've heard from people who were there last Thursday night, he was actually quite impressed with this car. I haven't seen anything published from him yet since the unveiling, which is peculiar. But he apparently likes it.
It's hard not to like. I know that there's been a lot of complaining on the internet about the way it looks, about the interior and its ergonomics, and I can see some of these complaints. There's the interior, especially. It has this row of buttons that are sort of laid out in a linear strip, and it's all oriented toward the driver versus the passenger. But I think what I want to do is actually drive it and see how that stuff is to operate. Because I can look at it and imagine that it's not good, but I've done that in the past, and I found out that once you actually operate it, it's like, okay, it's different, but it's not terrible. And it's not like it's a Porsche Panamera, the first generation Panamera, that I think had buttons on the visors and visors. I guess every car has visor buttons now with HomeLink, but that thing had buttons everywhere. It had buttons on its buttons. It was
It was bad.
So I mean, you can't just immediately crap on the Corvette.
But the way that strip of buttons is laid out, and for those that haven't seen it, we'll include it in the show art for this week. But the new Corvette has a very tall center console. Did we mention that the engine is now behind the driver?
Yes, it's mid-engine. That's right. That's the Corvette that's been coming for.
It's no longer a front mid-engine sports car; it's a rear mid-engine sports car.
And because the C7, they really said, and you can see it in the numbers that they posted, right? The C7 had just reached the limit of what you could do with front engine and rear drive, and so they had a couple of choices, right? You could go mid-engine, or you could go all-wheel drive. Those are about the two things you could do. And they decided to go mid-engine instead of add all-wheel drive to it, which I think was probably the right move because it's going to make a lighter car.
And I think I suspect that at some point there will be an all-wheel drive version of this Corvette, but with an electric motor at the front.
Oh yeah, that's a lot easier to pull off.
Yeah, so I think they will hybridize it with a front electric motor, and maybe even one at the rear as well. So sort of an NSX
when they do
layout.
that. And I haven't really, I wasn't at the event, so I didn't get a chance to poke around the car at all. I'd be really curious to see how they're going to package batteries into that, because it's not a big car.
No, but it does have that big center tunnel, which could be for a hybrid version. For a hybrid version, you could easily package the say a 7 or 8 kilowatt hour battery pack down that center tunnel, and then put a motor or two at the front axle, maybe another one at the rear. So again, like I said, a similar layout to what the NSX has, which has two front motors, one in the rear, and the NSX also has a dual clutch transmission, just like this thing does. So you could do that, and then the other thing that could ultimately be done, if you look at the size of this car, and the proportions, because the engine, the small block V8 is longitudinally mounted, there's enough space there between the cabin and the rear axle that you could pack a pretty good sized battery pack in the middle of this car, across where the engine sits right now, and probably have a pretty decent range as a battery electric version of this car.
Yeah, and just the amount of performance that opens up too. And I think that's the thing that I picked up on when they announced it was, okay, you got to remember, this is a $60,000 car. And you start looking at it.
Which is actually quite remarkable, because over the last several years, many of us have been talking about, this long rumored mid-engine Corvette, when we started seeing spy photos a couple of years back, and it started to become apparent that, this was either, real or, the most elaborate troll of Don Sherman ever, which right up until they actually announced it last week, I still was not convinced that
it
that
may
was not
still
the
be
case.
the case. You don't know.
It may still be. We haven't actually driven it yet. But at the very least, there's a lot that's really impressive about this, during the many of these conversations, we were thinking, we were wondering, if they do this as a mid-engine car, it's probably going to cost at least $100,000, and if that's the case, is this just going to be a high-end model, as part of the Corvette family, and they keep an updated version of the C7 around, to stay in that $50,000-$60,000 price range. But it was amazing that they announced that this thing the C8 is going to start at just under $60,000 with a 6.2 liter small block, LT2 small block, with 495 horsepower and 470 foot-pounds of torque.
Yeah, I mean, it just 0 to 60 in like 3 seconds. That's so fast,
Yes,
and that's the stock one, like just the entry level.
Yeah, that's the base. Actually, I guess that's actually for the the Z51.
Okay, so but Z51 is like a suspension package, right?
It's still the same. Yeah, it's just some suspension upgrades and tires. But the same powertrain. Same basic car. But still, I mean, it's even the base model is going to be in the 3-second range, which is remarkable for a $60,000 car, a $60,000 mid-engine sports
so
car.
think about, this is what all of you who complained about the NSX, this is what you people wanted. It's a straightforward mid-engine car. It's got a V8 in the middle of it. Certainly there's a lot of clever engineering and innovative tech that they had to do to pull this off. One of the most interesting things to me was that they call it the six, what is it? The town in India, it's named after something or other six. It just starts with a B, because that's where the casting factory is. The engine foundry is there because they've got 6 different cast aluminum elements in the chassis structure. And instead of doing your typical, weld them up out of sheet metal, it's
a mix of die castings and extrusions.
Yeah, but because of the way they're made, that increases rigidity and it reduces weight.
Right. It's high pressure die casting.
It's like the chassis is made at the engine factory, which I thought was a cool sort of. I think it's the Bedford 6. That's just a cool note. It's like, okay, we've gone from a bunch of sort of subframes that are made in the traditional way with traditional weight to this different tech that makes the car a lot stronger. And I think honestly, you're going to see the Corvette as sort of a showcase for technology that's going to wind up in other cars. And I that's something that I expect to see in other cars, but it's kind of being released to the world here in the Corvette. I know that its electrical architecture is another thing that we've already seen, right? That's the same electrical architecture that was used in the Cadillac. Was it the CT6?
The CT5. Okay. It's a new electrical architecture. It debuts in the CT5 this fall, and also in the CT4 and the Corvette. And then over the next several years, with each new redesigned platform, each time a platform is redesigned, it's going to get this. And this is a platform, this is an electrical architecture that has more powerful computing. They're going to start to consolidate a lot of the computers in the car, so you have fewer computers that are more powerful, a lot more networking bandwidth within the car to send all the sensor data around. So it'll enable things like more driver assist features, but also over-the-air software updates and all kinds of other functionality.
And is it 48 volt or?
It's not 48 volt. Well, it can support 48 volt, but right now GM has not announced any plans to do anything with 48 volt.
So they could do it.
It's more about the electronics, but it could support higher power delivery as well. And just for reference, okay, this new Corvette starts at $60,000. There's only one other mid-engine sports car that is less than $100,000 in the U.S. That's the Alpha 4C, which starts at $67,000.
So much rather have the Corvette. The 4C is a good time. Don't get me wrong, but
yeah, the 4C has a carbon fiber tub. And part of the reason that GM was able to make the Corvette so relatively affordable is they, rather than an exotic carbon fiber tub, they went with an aluminum structure. Which is going to be very strong. It's not going to be ultimately as light as carbon fiber, but it will do the job that's required of it. And they know how to manufacture that. They also know how to recycle it. At the car's end of life, which is something that you can't really readily do with a carbon fiber structure. They know how to repair it, which is also much more challenging to do with a carbon fiber structure. So, there's a lot of other cars, a lot of other very high-end cars that also use aluminum structures, and Corvettes have been made with aluminum structures for a long time now. So GM knows how to do that.
Well, and it's the thing. You've got this level of performance, this kind of layout for this price. So rather than complain, consider what you're getting for the money. I don't want to be, suggesting that we always append the, for a Corvette to the end of every superlative statement we're making. Like, yeah, it's really good for a Corvette.
No, I mean, disregard what badge is on this thing. If you just look at the specs and the capabilities of it, this is as good as, almost anything in the world, that costs less than $500,000.
I think it's going to deliver, in terms of performance testing, it's going to deliver a beating to cars that cost twice as much, if not more.
Oh, even 3, 4, 5 times.
And that's always been sort of the Corvette way. It's different. And anytime there's a big shift in Corvette, and this is the biggest one in a long time, there's
arguably the biggest ever.
Well, that's true. The layout is it's been rumored for as long as I've been alive. Change is scary to some people. I get it. But I think really, the team that developed this car has a track record of developing really good cars. It's going to ride and handle really well. And then they're going to continue to improve it throughout its life, because that's what they always do with the Corvette. And right out of the box, it's essentially, somebody compared the styling to a Ferrari F430, and they were basically like, okay, and when you put it in those terms, yeah, I'll take a Ferrari F430 that has a GM small block in it and a dealer that I can go to in town. It doesn't sound like for under $100,000. That doesn't sound like a problem to me. All of those sound like good things, and
that won't require $20,000 worth of service every year.
They did do some special Corvette things. It's got a dry sump oiling system, like we were talking about.
That's actually something that's really cool. They've done some really interesting packaging stuff on this. Like some of the people that were at the event were talking about, when you open up the engine compartment and look at the engine, the top of the engine actually sits below the top of the rear wheels.
That's low.
Because
it's not a tall engine anyway. The small block's tiny.
Right. Well, and that's one of the advantages of the small block, because it's a pushrod engine. It's not overhead cam, so overhead cam engines are inherently taller because you've got to put the camshafts up on top of the blocks, and they're wider. So this thing is relative. It's a remarkably small package, but it's even lower because it does have a standard dry sump oil system. In the past, GM's had dry sump versions of the engine for variants like the ZR1 and the Z06, but base Corvettes have never had that. It's now a standard system on there, and what they've done is the oil reservoir is actually packaged on the front end of the engine. It's bolted to the front of the engine, and because it's a dry sump, you don't have to have that big oil pan hanging on the bottom. You basically just have a cover, that's almost directly underneath the crankshaft, and the oil drips down in there, and there's a scavenge pump that sucks it out and pumps it up to the reservoir. So that allows them to mount the engine even lower in the car, which lowers the center of gravity of the car, which improves handling. And because of the way they've packaged all that, what's remarkable is the amount of cargo space that they've left in this thing. The C7 and the C6. One of the things that was really impressive about them is that under the rear hatch, you actually had a remarkable amount of cargo area back there. The thing that they always bragged about was you could fit 2 golf bags in the back of a Corvette. Well, turns out you can still do that even in this mid-engine Corvette. Yeah. You can fit 2 golf bags in there, and there's also a front trunk where you can put a standard size, carry-on bag that you can take on an airplane.
So that's pretty practical. And just, compare what you get with this car versus possibly its most sort of direct, price competitor, which would be, I would say, like a 911, because you can get a 911 in the high multi-thousands versus hundreds of thousands, right? Like,
yeah, I think they start somewhere in the $80,000 range.
This is gonna have a lot more performance for the dollar. And the 911 is easy to live with too. I think that's one of the secrets of that car's success is that it does, it's got the front trunk that's pretty roomy. It's got ostensibly 4 seats. It's, you can daily it without it.
They're not usable.
Sure.
It's a 2-seater. Just because it has a couple of seat belts back there doesn't make it a 4-seater.
The dog can get back there. depending on the
that's
dog.
True. So 911 currently starts at 91,000.
Okay, see, that's a lot of dough. But performance wise,
the Cayman starts at 57.
Yeah, I just have trouble comparing the Corvette directly to the Cayman. I feel like the Cayman is sort of out of its league.
Yeah, they're not really in the same price segment. Or same competitive set.
And they're both good cars. It's just interesting to see sort of where the Corvette shakes out. I can't really, I don't want to pile on about the styling because I haven't actually seen it. And once you see it, they look a lot. Cars like just in general.
I will admit, that the images I've seen so far of the car, without the camo, the design is growing on me. The front three quarters of it, I do kind of like. The rear, I'm still kind of mixed on. I will get to see one later this week, this weekend at the Concours of America, St. John's in Michigan. They're doing a design forum that I'm going to on Saturday with the Corvette designers, and they're going to have the C8 on display there at the Concours. So if you're going to the Concours this weekend in Plymouth, Michigan, you'll see the C8 out on the grounds. And I expect that I might even see one on Friday night at an event I'm going to that Mark Royce usually makes an appearance at. Last year, he showed up with his Corvette Grand Sport replica. And I wouldn't be surprised if he shows up this Friday night with a C8.
If he does, we'll have something to talk about.
Yeah.
The golf bag thing, I find it hilarious. Like, just that's the metric. Like, golf, really?
Well, if you look at who Corvette buyers have been for the last couple of decades, it's increasingly, an older male audience. And this is part of the reason why, there's obviously the technical arguments of, we wanted to continue making it better, and they reached the limits of what they could do with a front engine car, and going to a mid-engine car is, at least GM hopes will attract a new audience to the Corvette that would not have considered it before. They would have looked at it and said, this is something, for, older guys, in midlife crises or later, that like to play golf and, need something to demonstrate to the world that, their remaining virility.
Right. It's Viagra on wheels.
Exactly.
I love Corvettes. They have a lot of charm. The C6 is probably my favorite. I'm not really all that enamored with the C7, although it's a better car in all sort of objective measures. But this one, the C8 really captures my imagination, and I think it's probably, like you said, because of, my age and the cars that I grew up really impressed by. And, a lot of the cars that made an impression on me were those 70s and 80s and early 90s mid-engine cars. We were talking, of course, the Fiero, but also, the MR2. Those were like affordable mid-engine sports cars. And then everybody, I think, had a Countach poster or a Diablo,
That was a Ferrari 512 BB.
Okay, 512 BB. I was gonna get to the 308 because it's just it's a little bit of an icon. Those cars, they're a different flavor than the classic like 50s and 60s inspired Corvettes. And I've always been really impressed with what a Corvette will do. But I'm glad that they finally decided it was time to just really switch it up and like make a break from that tradition. Like at a certain point, the tradition holds you back, and I think that's what was going on. So, they finally did it. They made a mid-engine car.
It only took them 40 some years.
I mean, I'm a little sad it doesn't have a four-rotor Wankel in it.
Don't worry. Sooner or later, somebody will find one of the Mazda four-rotor Wankels that ran in the RX-7s and IMSA GTO back in the early '90s, and and stuff it into the
That's
back
true.
of one of these.
That's true. And it's
That would be some glorious
you can assemble
sound.
one, right? You just get a couple of.
Have you ever heard one of those?
They wail and they spit fire.
Oh yeah.
You can assemble a 4-rotor out of your own. You get a couple of 13Bs, right, and bolt them together, figure it all out.
And it's a little more complicated.
I like to minimize the difficulty. The thing, and the one thing I'll say before I move on anyway, I don't have much more to say about the Corvette beyond the idea that, like, okay, the golf clubs, if you're that older guy trying to put golf bags in there, that liftover is going to be a bitch.
That's a good point.
So,
although the same was true of the C7 and C6, they had, you'd still have to lift it over the back end of those cars, especially if you had a Z06 or a ZR1. I mean, the ZR1, really, with that big wing on the back, the C7 ZR1 wouldn't really be practical. But even the Z06, had a pretty tall spoiler in the back. But the base models, it's still a pretty high liftover. So I don't think that this is, in fact, this is probably easier because, on the C6 and C7, not only did you have a high liftover, but you had to reach forward, over the back of the car to get your golf bags in there into the hatch. Whereas this one, the trunk is right at the back, so you have that liftover, but then it's drop it right down, right there. So I think it might actually be easier.
Caddy do it. It's a paradigm shift. It's a big deal, and as much as the internet sort of lit itself, a car Twitter at the very least lit itself on fire, criticizing it. I want to see it out in the wild. I want to drive it, and I think I'll reserve actual judgment until I do, because $60,000 mid-engine car with a lot of performance, and you got to make compromises somewhere. And I think GM has been pretty smart about making the right compromises to keep the Corvette sort of priced at what it's priced at and performing the way it does. And so I expect that will continue. And once we drive them all, we'll be kind of happy with them.
Yeah, I suspect we will. Although I don't know, I still don't think I'll be happy with that interior layout with that long strip of buttons along the far side of the console, that kind of slopes up away from you.
Well, they could it wouldn't be the first time they've redesigned the entire interior of the car. Look at the C4, right? The C4 example is good. That thing came out with a very, very 1984 interior, and they redesigned that whole thing.
They got it all the way up to about 1987 by the time they were done.
It got
maybe
a full
88
interior redesign at some point. I can't remember what it was, the early 90s or what, or at least they significant changes to the dash and stuff. So
yeah, I mean they changed up the instrument cluster and did some other stuff, but it still wasn't great.
Yeah, it's progress. It's a different way to not be great.
BMTS Technologies, which is a company you've almost certainly never heard of, but there's actually a pretty decent chance that you may have driven some of their products. BMTS was spun off, I think, about 3 years ago. It was a company that was formed as a joint venture about a decade ago by Bosch and Molle, and the BMTS literally means Bosch Molle
Those
Turbo
expressive
Systems,
Germans again with their naming,
which was the there was the joint venture company that Bosch and Molle formed back in 2008, I think 2008 or 2009, to manufacture turbochargers. And a couple of years ago, they decided that even though turbos were still a decent business, it wasn't necessarily a business that they wanted to continue being in. They wanted to move on to other things, and so they spun it off to a private equity firm that has since also acquired a foundry company, an aluminum casting company, which makes BMTS Technologies the only turbocharger manufacturer that also has their own casting capabilities, which it turns out to be a fairly interesting proposition. I had the opportunity to attend an event with BMTS folks a few weeks ago and talked to some of their engineers and learned some interesting things about turbos and modern turbos. And one of the things that we've talked a bit about over the last several years, with all these turbocharged engines, especially like the Ford EcoBoost engines, is how they get decent fuel economy numbers on on the fuel on the drive cycles that are used for fuel economy testing, official testing. But a lot of times in the real world, the numbers don't match up to those label numbers, and especially when you're driving them fairly hard, or in the trucks, if you're towing a significant load, the fuel economy tends to drop off pretty significantly. And if you've looked at a lot of these cars, especially ones that are white, like if you ever look at a white Ford Fusion with an EcoBoost engine in it, look at the area around the tailpipes, exhaust pipes. And you'll notice they tend to be stained with a lot of black soot. And it turns out the reason why they get such bad fuel economy under load is because they end up having to run the engines really rich when you run under load for any significant amount of time in order to keep the turbo temperatures down. Because you run them rich, it keeps the exhaust temperatures down, and the turbo doesn't.
Well, that was one of my favorite things, having turbocharged cars, is you beat the hell out of them for a while at night, and then you open the hood, and the turbo is glowing quite brightly.
Oh yeah, and so what BMTS has actually been doing is they've been working on materials for the turbo casting and the internal components of the turbo, and with their casting division now, they have actually developed some new alloys for their turbos that are going to be coming out that will provide much better, much more heat resistance. They'll be much more durable at high temperatures, and so they won't have to run them rich like that, which means that they should get significantly better real-world fuel economy than a lot of the existing turbos do.
Yeah, well, and that's are they playing with composites like ceramics at all or anything, or is it all just strictly?
No, they're not. They're still it's still all metal, but they've got some new alloys that have much higher temperature resistance, much higher melting points. So they're not going to start to break down or crack or anything at high temperatures. So they should be much more durable, and be able to run for longer periods at high temperatures.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in the turbo. When you start to appreciate that it's in the exhaust stream, and there's the turbine side of it, and then there's the compressor side of it, and you got
that are running at two very different temperature
and
levels.
You've got a shaft in between. It's got the floating bearings.
And these things are spinning at 100,000 RPM.
Yeah, and the impellers, you want to make sure those hold together because they're right there. You don't want to melt those.
Nope.
Yeah, there's a lot going on even in just a sort of standard turbo.
And then on top of that, they're also developing e-turbos, which should be coming to market in the next year or so, which add an electric motor to the turbo in between the turbine and the compressor. And what that does is it allows you to use some electrical energy to spin the turbo up. So when you're at low boost or low load conditions, when you step on it, the motor can spin up the turbo much faster. Way before the turbine. The exhaust gases will build up enough pressure to spin up the turbine. And so you can get more instantaneous boost at low RPM or low load conditions when you step on it. And then the flip side of that is, on overrun, when you lift off, the exhaust gases are actually going to spin that motor and turn it into a generator. So
that was one of those things. Like sometimes you just sit and you try to imagine things, and one of the things that I think is untapped potential is converting heat energy into electricity, because we don't really have a good way to do that. You can't capture the heat and just generate electricity from it.
Well, in this case, you're not really capturing the heat. It's more of the kinetic energy of the exhaust gases.
Yeah, it's the pressure drop, but it's still sort of just a way, like, otherwise it would be lost. And that's a real benefit that we get from racing. Is the exhaust turbines, which is essentially what they are, the turbochargers that spin an electric generator, and you capture some of that power that's otherwise it does just go out the tailpipe.
Yeah, this stuff's been used on some current Formula One engines, and also on some of the LMP1 prototypes that are running at Le Mans. The Porsches and Audis used similar type of e-turbos to capture as one of their two kinetic energy recovery systems, or energy recovery systems. They had the electric motors on the front axles that were doing regenerative braking, and then also using the e-turbos to capture energy from the exhaust gases.
So would they tell you who's using this stuff, or who's going to use it?
Not who's using the e-turbos. That hasn't been publicly announced yet. I
would be shocked if BMW didn't start using this stuff in some way in the next 5 years. Because they've already got efficient dynamics that's trying to recapture as much energy as possible.
So, yeah, it's certainly possible. It'll be somebody that's doing 48 volt electrical systems, because the e-turbos, really need to operate with a 48 volt system.
Are they geared? Do they have like a gearbox to get the turbo up to speed, or is it
no? The motor is on the same shaft with the compressor and the turbine. So it's just a direct drive.
That's a lot of speed for an electric motor.
But
all right,
they say it'll work. I mean, and there's stuff out there. There are e-compressors out there in the marketplace today. Mercedes-Benz on their new 3-liter inline six uses a combination. They use an e-compressor, which is just the compressor side of this with a motor. It's not exhaust driven. In series with regular exhaust-driven turbos on that engine, and Audi's also doing this on the SQ7 engine. So they're in that case, rather than packaging them in a single unit like BMTS is doing, and Honeywell, which is now Garrett Turbo Systems. They spun it off to Garrett. So Garrett and BMTS are both doing these e-turbos, which combine an exhaust-driven turbo and an e-compressor into a single unit. The e-compressors can't do the energy recuperation because there's no exhaust gases driving it. So they use a smaller e-compressor for low RPM operation, to get that initial burst of boost, and until the exhaust-driven turbos build up boost. And then it switches over. Some of the vehicles, some of the OEMs that are using BMTS turbos, Bentley, Volkswagen Group has it on a number of vehicles. The Jetta 1.4 liter TSI has a BMTS turbo in it. It's a conventional one. It's not an e-turbo. Bentley, the Bentley Bentayga has BMTS turbos on it. There's a number of manufacturers that are using BMTS turbos in production today. And the e-turbos should be coming out in the next couple of years.
And they do OEM and they do aftermarket, although I'm assuming you're not going to see.
And they also do commercial vehicle applications, so they make big turbos for trucks as well.
Very big. Those like the ones you see on like mining.
Yeah, the big, massive ones.
That some schmuck will buy and like bolt to their 2Js.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
And you say turbo lag.
Cool. Yeah, that's okay. Once the boost is in,
it's all in.
Yeah. All right, we are out of boost.
Yeah. And next time we'll be back with Rebecca. So be the whole gang again. And that's it for tonight.
All right. Well, hey, thanks everybody for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Bye.